if you tuned in last year for our webinar training, you are going to see that a lot of this information is the same. There haven't been too many major changes, so you can consider this a good refresher before the season starts. But we do have a few new things. And if you are totally new this season, you might find that this is a lot of information. So, like I said, this is going to be available for you to rewatch. But of course, you can always reach out to me or the Bumblebee Atlas team in general, and we have a lot of good resources on our website to help walk you through the survey process. So I do need to start by thanking our partners. I am the only Xerces staff right now in the southeastern United States, and I cover 4 state regions. So as you can imagine, I rely really heavily on our partners for finding places to host events, looking for good habitats, just good contacts within these agencies. It's really, really important for this project's success, and we have some really great partners across the states. We're funded by a USDA grant for Working Lands for Wildlife, and that is through Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever. So that's our current funding. Like I said, I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a science-based nonprofit, and everyone on our staff really works towards the mission of protecting invertebrates and the habitats that support them. And we have multiple programs that do this. I am on the endangered species team, and we gather data to fill these data gaps, and this helps to inform management of rare species. So I work on the bumblebee team, but we also have mussels, we have a firefly team, we have a western monarch team. There's also a native pollinator crew, and they work with private landowners to increase and improve the pollinator habitat on their lands. There's a separate aquatic invertebrate team, a butterfly conservation team, and a crew that researches the effects of pesticides on all these species that we love. And we all really work toward the conservation of invertebrates, and we're very proud of the work that we do. I'm sure some of you here are members of the organization, so I just want to say thank you very much. And if this is something that you are interested in doing in the future, we are always very grateful to our members for helping support us. So today we're going to be covering some big topics. First is the ecology and conservation of bumblebees. We're then going to go into what is a Bumblebee Atlas, how did this come up, what is the purpose. We'll have a little break. And then the real bulk of the training is the participating how-to. And I'm going to walk you through all of the steps of how do you pick a site? How do you actually do a survey? How do you fill out the data sheet? How do you upload your data? And then at the end, we'll have some more time for question and answer. I also want to point out, in the past, we've included a little Bumblebee ID as part of this training, but I decided this year to make a more in-depth Bumblebee identification training. So we're going to do that as separately, and that's going to be 2 weeks from today at the same time. So it's going to be March 24th at 6 p.m. I've seen quite a few people have already registered, but if you haven't, we would love to see you there. All right, so there is a really great resource for you that's a deep dive into the ecology and conservation of bumblebees, and this is on our website. And I'm going to talk about some of these things today, but if you want to spend like 2 hours just learning about bumblebee ecology and conservation, I definitely recommend watching this. A lot of my really smart colleagues have talked about some really interesting things here. So why do we, as Xerces Society and as a Bumblebee Atlas, care about invertebrates? Invertebrates make up 90% of our animal biodiversity, and they play really, really crucial environmental roles. So they help with the decomposition of organic materials. They are the base of the food chain in many cases, and they also perform this amazing service called pollination. And I'm sure you're aware of what pollination is, but just as a little reminder, in this example, this bee is landing on this daylily looking flower, and when it's going there to get pollen and nectar, and when it's going to the flower, it's getting that pollen on its body, and the pollen's from like the male reproductive part. It's then traveling to another flower of the same species, and that pollen's then getting on the female reproductive part, and pollination occurs. And, plants have all kinds of strategies to avoid self-pollination, and animals really help to disperse the pollen to further locations. So we have such an amazing array of pollinator diversity, and most of the pollinators are insects. Of course, we also have hummingbirds, but people think of bees often for good reason, but there's also butterflies, moths, wasps, beetles. Lots of different insects are pollinators. Just a few shout outs to pollinators in general here. 1 in 3 bites of food that we eat is courtesy of insect pollination. And then 90% of the world's plants depend on pollinators to reproduce. So this is a major source for us. And not only for us, but pollinators provide food and habitat for wildlife. So whether it's, songbirds feeding their young insects or the squirrel here eating a grasshopper, you can also think about like the nuts and seeds that are products of pollination provide food for a lot of wildlife. And then habitat-wise, we're talking about, the understory forbs as well as the shrubs that provide shelter for a lot of, small mammals and birds. And then the canopy cover of often in the Southeast, flowering trees. We have most of our species here are flowering plants, and they need pollinators to reproduce. So bees really are the most efficient pollinators. Many different animals act as pollinators, but bees are the most efficient, and they rely on flowers for food. So the nectar provides that carbohydrate, sugar, it's energy, and the pollen is a source of protein and other nutrients. And bees are intentionally collecting and transporting pollen because they're bringing it back to the nest to feed their larvae. And so they have these special pollen catching hairs and pollen carrying structures. And, some bees have a pollen basket, some it's under their abdomen. They all have a different strategy for this. There are so many different kinds of bees. We're going to really focus on bumblebees today, but I just wanted to show you the amazing color variation. Some are furry, some are tiny, some are large, all different shapes and sizes. And in the Southeast, we have over 500 species of bees. So 250 species of bumblebees worldwide. In North America, we have 50, and in the Southeast, we have 16. And some of those are haven't been found here in a long time, are historic. Um, the map on the right shows where bumblebee diversity is highest in North America, and so the darkest blue represents the most species. So you can see we are not the area that has the highest diversity of bumblebees. And those areas really are areas of high elevation and high latitude. So bumblebees really like the cooler climates. And you can see in our region, the mountain strip there of the Appalachians is where we have the highest diversity. So bumblebees are incredibly important pollinators. There's a few main reasons for this. One, they have really large bodies, so they can remain active in cooler weather from the time when like the spring ephemerals are out, basically now, almost now, until really late fall when the last things are flowering. You can see bumblebees out on the landscape. I've already seen a few in my yard, which is just amazing to me. They also have really long tongues, so they can pollinate a lot of different kinds of flowers. And bumblebees are considered to be generalists, and this means they can forage on many different kinds of flowers. But on the other hand, there's many plants that are specialized to bumblebees, such as those that have those really long corollas that only a long bumblebee tongue can reach. And then bumblebees also have this amazing ability to perform buzz pollination. So that's the video that you're seeing here. This bumblebee has clamped on to these anthers of this plant that appears to be in the Solanaceae family. So that'd be like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and potatoes and like our native horse nettles. And it's actually like shaking its body using its flight muscles. It's vibrating, and the pollen is coming out of these special anthers. And this kind of plant really requires buzz pollination. So as you can think about, that's a lot of really important crops for us. Also, if you imagine like what we call urn-shaped flowers, which have It's almost like a bell with a really narrow end. Those are also flowers that really benefit from buzz pollination. So that's thinking about blueberries and cranberries and huckleberries. The bumblebee can just land on the end and shake it until the pollen comes out. So many of our important crops really do rely on bumblebees. I'm going to talk briefly about the nesting cycle of a bumblebee, but you can dive so much deeper into this. It really is fascinating. So in the winter, now and earlier, the queens are in hibernation. So they're typically just a few inches under some loose soil, leaf litter, or like pine needle duff, and they're hibernating. In the spring, due to environmental cues, they awaken and they come out of hibernation and they start foraging. So this is the time they're really foraging on those early spring plants. The queens are really big. You might see them out and about right now, even. And then in late spring, they start searching for a place to nest. So bumblebees don't like dig out their own nests, but they generally nest in cavities and they're searching for cavities that already exist. So that could be like a rodent hole, it could be in a pile of rocks, it could be like in a log that's kind of rotted out. But the queen is looking for a place to lay her eggs, and then she does, and she lays her eggs, and she actually sits on top of her eggs and incubates them like a bird. And then in the summer, the first generation that emerges are worker bees, and they're all female, and they take over the role of foraging, and the queen then just remains in the nest for the rest of her life. And multiple generations of workers emerge throughout the summer. So then by late summer and early fall, the colony changes to start producing reproductive individuals. So these are males and the new queens, and the new queens disperse and the males disperse and they mate with other individuals from other colonies of the same species. And then the males die off and the previous colonies die off, and all that's left are the queens, and they go into hibernation, and then the cycle begins again. So that's like the general bumblebee life cycle. However, we have a fun twist on this, which are called the cuckoo bumblebees. So if you've heard of cuckoo birds, it's a similar concept. They're considered social parasites. So a cuckoo queen emerges and she forages. But instead of creating her own nest, she actually kills the queen of another species and she tricks the workers to forage for her and her new offspring instead. And so, because she has workers of another species doing all her work, she doesn't create any of her own worker bees. And instead, cuckoos only have queens and males. And we do have some cuckoo species in our region, and it sounds vicious. That we do love, we love cuckoos as well. They're really cool. So I told you what we do know, but there really is a lot that we don't know. So we don't know where species are struggling, where they're thriving. We're still learning a lot about what their specific habitat requirements are, especially across the region. We also need to learn more about how far and where queens and males are dispersing. So, around 20 to 30 years ago, researchers really started to notice that, wow, these bumblebees are not seeming as common as they once were, especially species that used to be seen all the time. And so they did some in-depth status assessments, and they found that of the 50 species in North America, 28 of them seem to be doing fine. These are considered species of least concern. Five were unable to be assessed due to just a lack of data. And then 25% of the bumblebees fell into these categories that are considered species of greatest conservation need. In the Southeast, we have 6 of these species. So we have the rusty patch bumblebee. This is the only species in our region that is federally endangered, federally listed. It has not been seen in our states for around 20 years. However, it's been found just north of us in Virginia very recently. The main part of its range is really more in the Midwest. We have the variable cuckoo is also more of a historic species here. However, it could still be found, but it hasn't been seen here in like 30 years. The southern plains bumblebee, however, we see frequently, but it is one of our species of conservation concern because it has a declining population. That's the same for the American bumblebee. It's one you might see in your yard, but it is considered to be declining. And then the yellow bumblebee and the yellow banded bumblebee, both are species that we're only really finding in the mountains in our region, and both are also considered to have a declining population. So why are bumblebees declining? This is a complicated subject. We say it's death by a thousand cuts, which really means there's just many threats to insects and especially to pollinators, and it makes the conservation action to improve their populations even more complicated. So looking first at something like habitat loss, we know that bumblebees rely on flowers for food, and they rely on that from very early spring when the queens come out all the way until very late fall when the queens go back into hibernation. So they really need those floral resources to be available throughout that whole time. They also need safe places to nest and overwinter. And you can imagine that development and lawns and single species agriculture can be detrimental to having those characteristics. Just like all other organisms, bumblebees are susceptible to pathogens and to parasites, and one of the main sources of diseases that can really decimate native bumblebee populations is from commercial bumblebee colonies. Pesticides, remember that insecticide really kills all insects. There's not like bee safe insecticide. They could be exposed by landing on treated flowers. They can also carry that treated nectar back to their larvae, which could, decrease their foraging ability. There's all sorts of effects that we don't totally understand yet when it comes to pesticide exposure. And then climate change. So remember the map where we said bees like cool temperatures? They are negatively affected by higher temperatures. Also, increases in droughts and wildfires can really affect those flowering habitats that they need. There's also concern for something we call a phenotypic mismatch when the timing of when the queens emerge and the timing of when when the plants are flowering might not match up anymore if the climate changes. So these are all major concerns and threats for bumblebees. There's been a lot of improvement in our awareness of pollinators, and there's been lots of habitat creation and funding for habitat creation, but we don't totally know how this is affecting our pollinator species. And so we can't detect declines or recoveries if we don't have that baseline data. And so we started a Bumblebee Atlas. And now we're going to talk about what even is a Bumblebee Atlas. So my role at Xerces, like I said, is to run the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas, and this is a community science project. Community science meaning you don't have to be a professional entomologist to participate in this project. Anyone can learn and participate and join. We are very glad to have you. And the goal of the atlas is to gather data about where bumblebees are found, the types of habitats they're using, also what flowers that they're relying on. And our little region is just one part of a much larger project. We are now a 21 state project, which is amazing. This year, our newest member is New Mexico. And you can see we have many, many partners that we work with across the whole country that provide funding and provide expertise and provide personnel. But really, the bulk of all of our data is coming from our volunteers. Here's our team at Xerces, a bunch of passionate bumblebee folks that all make this possible in their own regions. And I want to talk about what has happened since the Bumblebee Atlas project began. So you can see the first project started in the Pacific Northwest in 2018, and the observations came streaming in. And the Southeastern project started in 2023, so this upcoming year will be the fourth year of the project. And where the project started, the observations have just exponentially increased. I want to show you another way to look at this. So the map on the left is our human population density map. So red is where lots of people live. So we're looking at Los Angeles. We see Miami. We see Chicago on there. And then on the right is iNaturalist Bumblebee observations. And, I have no problem with iNaturalist. I use it. I think it's a great tool. However, often we see that the observations are come from where people live, right? It's a similar map. Looking from one side to the other, observations are where people are living. However, when you look at human population density versus Bumblebee Watch observations, and Bumblebee Watch is where we house our data, you can see that there's a lot of observations in places where people don't live. And that's a huge part of what we're doing. We're trying to increase data collection in more rural areas and on public lands and just get a bigger picture about what's going on across a whole region rather than just in our urban population centers. So what is all this data used for? We have research publications. There's notes on nesting habitat. We've created state ID guides. There's also habitat management guides for some of our longer running projects. And also, this data goes towards something really important, which is our state wildlife action plans have a species of greatest conservation need list, and that list determines which species to prioritize for conservation action. So any species that makes that list gets more funding, it gets more biologist support and effort, and it's really important for species in need to end up on their state lists. And to come up with a list, it's basically like a big calculator, and that takes in a bunch of different kinds of available data. So it takes in species observations, ranges, changes in ranges, threat factors, and a risk value then is determined. And we have been able to share our Bumblebee Atlas data with states across the country. And it really has improved the accuracy of the calculators, and it's put bumblebees on these lists. So as of this year, every state in the Southeast, and actually 49 out of 50 states, I just heard, in the US, have bumblebees listed on their state wildlife action plans, which is amazing. Last time I gave this presentation, I said, hopefully South Carolina and Tennessee will list bumblebees soon. And here it goes. South Carolina came out with more species than any other state. So this is just really, really great. And this means the word's getting out about the importance of these species and that our data was really, really critical in proposing that these species become part of the state, the species of greatest conservation need list. So here's a map of where our survey effort has occurred so far in the region. The darker purple represents where we've had the most effort so far. So you can see we've covered some places really well, and we also still have some major gaps. This is another view of that showing where we've done surveys and then also where there are incidental observations. I'll talk about what the difference between those is, but both are data points. So for the first 3 seasons of the project, there were 775 surveys and over 7,000 observations, and 12 species were detected, including 3 of the endangered or vulnerable species. So that was the American bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, and then also the southern plains bumblebee have all been detected in our species somewhat regularly. So that's really the big, why do we have a Bumblebee Atlas? What is the point of this? And I wanna, before I dive into the big, how does this work and how do we participate, I wanna see if there's any particular questions now to answer. And then we'll take a little 5-minute break and dive into the rest of this. So let's see here.
Yeah, as we're looking at questions, I also just want to say I put the Xerces website in the chat and then the Train Online link in the chat. So if people wanted to watch that in-depth ecology and conservation webinar, that's where to look for it. And right now, Avery, I've just seen there's 2 questions that are in there that I waited for you to answer.
Okay.
So one says, I know a landowner in a rural Tennessee county who has about 15 acres planted in conservation plots that are wonderful bumblebee forage. This includes different mixes of flowering plants occurring in different habitats, with bloom time spanning the season. I conducted one survey there in 2025. Can I conduct two surveys on this property in 2026? If so, what would be appropriate separation between the two surveys? Would they need to occur in different months or seasons?
That's a good question. I'm also so excited to hear about this place, and I'm excited to see what data you're collecting there. Um, it sounds like you went there last year and must have had some success if you want to go back. You can absolutely return to the same place. Getting data from season to season is important, especially for in a place with so many acres. It seems like you could absolutely survey in just a different part this year than you went to last year, but I think all of this seems like a great place to go. Um, we say that ideally you'd want to space your surveys at least 2 weeks apart. I would say even more ideally, it's really great to get data from early in the season and then like mid-season or later in the season, because what's available for the bumblebees to forage on is going to be really, really different at those times of year. If you go out in, June, you're going to have a lot of those early season flowers, and then if you go out in July, you might start getting some of the late season flowers. But technically, as long as it's 2 weeks apart, that is totally reasonable. And I'm again excited to see what you find.
Well, thanks. Here's another question. Going back to when you were talking about the life cycle of the colony, do the bees intentionally have all female baby bees at the beginning of the year? And if so, how do they do that?
They do intentionally have females, and that's because they're the workers. So the female bees are the ones that have the pollen basket. They're able to collect the pollen and bring it back to the nest to feed the larvae. So how they do that is absolutely beyond me. Maybe Amy, do you know how they do that?
Yeah, so like all Hymenoptera are really interesting, bees and wasps and ants. So when the females and males mate in the fall, the females actually will store the sperm in their bodies, and so they can choose whether or not to fertilize the eggs. And they will fertilize the females, and then they will not fertilize the males. So when they're fertilizing those females, those are the workers. And then when they have unfertilized eggs at the end, they just lay the eggs that aren't they're not fertilized to get the males. And then things get a little bit tricky when going from workers to queens. It has to do with nutrition, it has to do with chemical signals, and things like that are going on with that colony. So it's a lot of cool stuff, not all of which is totally understood.
That's amazing. I appreciate you answering that. And
Yeah.
it is true that it is, I mean, intentional in the way that it happens. Who knows if they're actually deciding to do that or not. But the first generation and the next few generations are always the females because those are the workers and they need them earlier in the season.
Cool. Great question. That's really fun stuff
It's a big
to learn
one.
about and dig into. You've got a couple more questions that popped up. So one says, where are volunteer groups near Greenville, South Carolina that promote Xerces surveys?
So I can think of one off the top of my head, which is the Conisty Nature Preserve. Oh, I think I saw your email today, so I'm glad you asked that here too, because other people here might have similar interest in Greenville. But I led a workshop at Conisty Nature Preserve last year in Greenville, and they were super excited to have us. And I know they would be very open to people doing surveys there. They have some really good habitat. And I know there was we had like 30 people show up. Other than that, I would definitely look into your native plant societies and also the master naturalist groups. I think there's an upstate master naturalist group that may or may not be near Greenville, but is in that part of the state, and that's a good start. But let me think more about that, and I can always reach back out to you.
Nice. Thanks, Avery. And one more I see right now says, are any of the bumblebees listed for North Carolina considered solitary bees?
So bumblebees are not solitary bees. So there are likely some solitary bees that are on our state species of greatest conservation needs list for North Carolina, but those are not bumblebees because bumblebees are colony bees and they all nest in colonies. But that's a good question. Most of the bees are solitary bees, but just not bumblebees. All right. Thank
Okay.
you for those
All
questions.
questions.
All
Yep.
right. Let's take a little 5 to 7 minute break since that might give us a little more or what time is it? 6:37. So let's meet up at 6:45 and we can go through the how to participate in that list. So get a drink of water and this is the part where you might want a pen and paper to write some things down with. So we'll see you back here at 6:45. All right. Let's move on to how to participate in the Bumblebee Atlas. Okay, first I want to tell you about a few websites that are available to you and are going to be helpful for you in different ways. And it's a little confusing where everything is stored. So I just want to make this clear here. So the first is bumblebeeatlas.org. This is our project website. On here, you can find training materials. You can find this video is going to be posted on there. That's also where you're going to find a link to our Southeast page. That's where you can see the data highlights. BumblebeeWatch.org is where we keep our data. So we upload our data there. You'll upload your photos there, your survey data. You can also look at maps to see where bumblebees have been seen in your area. You can look at other people's observations. It's a really fun place to actually just explore around. And then Xerces.org is our organizational website. And you'll find our podcast on there, Bug Banter. I want to give that a shout out because it's great. Also, you can find some print materials, like brochures, other things you can, other projects that are part of Xerces are going to be on there too. So you can learn more about the bigger work of the organization. So, how do you participate in the Bumblebee Atlas? The first thing you need to do is attend a training, and you fortunately are doing that right now. So you have almost completed step number one. Also, people have the option of attending an in-person workshop. Where that's going to take place this year is still being determined, so you'll hear more about that soon. And you can also get more experience at our hands-on field events. And this is not a full training, this is more practice with your netting skills, practice with IDing, going somewhere beautiful like Jekyll Island in Georgia, and getting to meet other people that are participating in the project and ask your questions that way. So you're going to hear more about any events that are happening in the Southeast coming up here soon. So the next step is to adopt a grid cell, and our region is broken down into 276 grid cells, and these are all approximately the same size. And really, this is a way that we organize our progress in attempting to cover the whole region. And when you adopt a grid cell, that means that you are committing to completing 2 surveys during the upcoming field season. So, for even more conservation impact, you could adopt a priority grid cell. And these are in places where we need more data. And they also contain an area that we believe is going to be really good habitat. And that's what those little pink triangles are. That's a priority site that has been selected based on some botanical information we have and sites that we know are good bumblebee sites. So you could also adopt one of these more like tan, light yellow sites, grid cells, which are also in the data needed category, but these are sites we haven't necessarily found a particular spot that we say this is great habitat. However, if you live in one of these grid cells, or if you know of a spot in one of these grid cells, we absolutely need data there, and it would be great if you could adopt it and do surveys there. The blue color is what we're considering to be complete. And these are areas where we've had a lot of success so far serving for bumblebees. And as you can see, a lot of them are also our population centers. If you plan to survey in one of those grid cells, we absolutely will still accept your data. But we are trying to encourage people to branch out a little bit to a nearby site if they can. So to adopt a grid cell, you'll go to the Bumblebee Atlas website, get involved, and then the next step down is adopt a grid cell, and you'll see a big map that comes up of the whole country, and you can zoom in to the Southeast region, and you'll see this map again. So it's the same colors I just showed you. And if you zoom in further, you'll see the actual grid cell labels, and you can look at where you live or where you're planning to survey and find out which grid cell it is. And then if you scroll down on the page, this is the survey form that you'll fill out to officially adopt your grid cell. And you should get then a confirmation email that you've adopted your grid cell. Some frequently asked questions that I'll just clear up here. Can I do more than 2 surveys in my grid cell? Yes, please, absolutely. Can I survey with a group? You can survey with a group. You're just gonna want to make sure that you calculate your survey effort correctly, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Um, Going out with a group's great. I definitely recommend it. It's really fun and like the more eyes, the better. Do I survey at the same spot every time? This is definitely up to you. As long as you're within your grid cell doing 2 surveys, you can choose where you'd like to go. Maybe the golden standard is 2 surveys in the same spot is really interesting for us to look at for data analysis. But if you went to a site and maybe it just like wasn't very good habitat or it just got mowed, you can definitely choose a different site for your next survey. Can more than one person adopt a grid cell? Yes. But there is a chance we might close a grid cell if it just is the only one that's getting adopted over and over again. We love it for you to go, somewhere new. Can I survey outside my grid cell? The answer to that is also yes. If you're just going somewhere once and you don't want to adopt the grid cell, but you still want to do a survey, we will, of course, accept your data gladly. Can I adopt more than one grid cell? You definitely can, and we would be grateful. Okay, so you've done a training, you've adopted a grid cell, and now the real fun part is doing a survey. And the first thing you want to do is come up with a good game plan. So where can you survey? You could choose to survey in a natural area, so that'd be like a state park or a state forest, maybe a national park, maybe a wildlife management area. You could choose to survey in an urban area if you know of someone who has a great pollinator garden, or if like your local library has a great pollinator garden. Also, you could survey on the public roadsides and right-of-ways. So really anywhere with good native flowers would be a great place to do surveys. So I mentioned our priority survey areas before, and these are spots that we pick to help guide you to a site if you're just not sure where to go. And if you know of a spot you really want to go to and you don't see it listed here, you should still go there. This is for people who just like want a little bit of help, or they're like, you know what, I want to go to a new spot this year. So these are all places that have known flowering areas and are all places that need more data or really have a potential for finding some of our rarer species. So this map here is on the SEBA website, and it's an interactive map, so you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and if you click on one of these triangles, you'll see the name of the site and what grid cell it's in and who owns it, which is important for learning about how to get permission. So we do need permission to survey anywhere that we're going to survey. If you own the land, you don't need permission, but if it's your neighbor's land, you do want to make sure you get permission from them to do a survey. But for any public lands, we do need to get like written permission from the land manager. So we have permits already in place and or are in the process of being renewed for many of the public lands in the region, including state parks, state forests, wildlife management areas, state natural areas, a few national parks, and also a few national forests. We've already acquired permission last year and are expecting to again this year. So if you'd like to survey in any of these places, you can fill out the form on the SEBA website. It's a big button, you'll see it. And so that means we can add your name to this permit, and then you will get a copy of the permit that has more instructions about what you need to do when you go to the site. I also created a little surveying how-to that just explains more about the process I just talked about, and also in here is some language that you can use if you'd like to reach out yourself to acquire permission. And I recommend that if it's a big public land like a state land or federal land, that's usually a formal process that will help you with. But if it's a more local land like a city park, or like a county park even, or a state botanical garden or something like that, That process is going to be more informal, and you can reach out yourself with some language I provided in this document, which is also on our website, to reach out and ask for permission yourselves. And often they'll be like, "Oh, that'd be great. We'd love to know what you have there." But they do need to be aware of the process of like what is a survey. Okay, when do you survey? Our season is May through September, so that's when you'll want to do a survey. You do want to go when there's flowers in bloom, so you want to make sure that before you go out, you expect there to be something blooming there. You don't want to survey when it's too hot or too cold, or when it's raining, or when it's really windy. There's two different types of surveys you can do. So you could do a point survey, or you can do a roadside survey. A point survey is really our like preferred survey method. This is surveying a 1 hectare area, and you're most likely going to be estimating the size of a hectare. It's around 2.5 acres. You can also think of it as the size of a soccer field. And so you want to find somewhere that has 1 hectare of flowering habitat. That can be tricky sometimes, I understand that. The length of the survey is 45 person minutes. Person minutes really just means total minutes. So if you went out with a 3-person group, you would each survey for 15 minutes to total 45 minutes. The completion of a point survey is 1 bumblebee survey and then 1 habitat assessment. I'll talk about the habitat assessment too. The other option is a roadside survey. So this might be a better option for you if you live somewhere where there isn't public land available, or if you're in an agricultural area where there's just more flowering along the roadside. We absolutely welcome roadside surveys as well. So you'll want to do 5 basically mini surveys. These are a shorter amount of time. So 5 15-minute surveys, and you want to make sure they're at least a mile apart so you're not counting the same bees over and over again. You want to process, which means photograph your bees and release them at each site. No taking bees in your car with you. And then you'll need to do 1 habitat assessment at each of these mini survey sites. The other option for data that we accept is an incidental observation. And this is more like if you've used iNaturalist, you might think of it more like that, where you are out and about and you see a bumblebee and you take a really good photo of it. Or if you aren't going to do a full survey, but you ended up catching a few bees and you want to take photos of those bees and submit them, this is how we collect these incidental observations. And you're still going to record your host plant. So it's really, really valuable information. We get a lot of info this way too. So what do you need to bring to do a Bumblebee Atlas survey? You'll want to bring a net, some vials, and we have a like equipment needed section on our website you can look at for more information about where to find these nets and vials. You'll want to bring your phone most likely as your camera, unless you have a good camera you want to use, a timer, which can also be your phone. You'll need a cooler with ice in it, something to write down on your data sheet. You want to bring any permits that you need if you are on public lands, and then of course anything you need to just be safe outside in the sun. So before you set out, think about weather, think about hunting season if you're on like a wildlife management area or a national forest. Make sure you are somewhere you have permission to survey. Make sure if you're doing a roadside survey that you're visible. Also consider a few different locations within your grid as a contingency plan. If you drive out down a dirt road and you get to a site and it's like been completely mowed in the last week, that's probably not a great place to do a survey, but maybe you had another like roadside spot in mind on your way in. It's nice to have a backup so you're not wasting your time. And then also you can look at iNaturalist, you could look at Facebook, you can talk to people about where they've seen good flowering habitat lately, because that's really where you want to go. Okay, so you have a plan, and now you're collecting data. So this is the top part of our data sheet, which you can find on our website, and you can print it out or make copies of it. And so first you'll need to enter the site name, and this is a name that you make up that you remember. The grid cell ID, the date, and then your lat long. And you can enter your latitude, longitude in the field, Or you can use one of our online maps that I'll show you in a little bit that you can zoom in and find where you are, and it'll populate your lat long that way. How many people did you go out with? Who'd you go out with? Did you do a point survey, a roadside survey? How big of a survey area? And then we have a couple different survey methods. So you could choose to capture all the bees that you saw. You could choose to capture different species of bees. So this is really an option if you can tell bumblebee species apart. And then you can also choose to capture a combination of these two methods. So let's say you start and say, I'm going to catch every bee I see, and like you get 10 common easterns, and you're thinking, you know what, I know there's other bees here. I'm going to put in more effort instead to find a different species. That'd be combination. And all of these are really valid methods. Okay, you'll need to write down your weather information at your site as well. And then you actually do your survey. So record your start time and start your timer. And you want to search the whole area. So this photo, you might think, wow, I don't even see anything flowering there. But we actually ended up catching, I think, like 6 species this day. So it was a good site. But some of these flowers are like tucked under the grass or right on the edge. And so it's really important to cover your whole hectare and look at flowers that are showy, flowers that are small, flowers that are hidden. You know, the bees like things that you might not think are as visually as exciting as humans like. So you want to capture the bees, and when you capture a bee, you want to stop your timer. So the timer, when it's running, should be your effort searching. So anytime your timer's running is when you're looking for bees, and when you're walking back and forth to your cooler or like looking at your ID sheet, getting your net fixed or whatever, that shouldn't be time that's considered your survey time. How do you capture a bee? This is something I can't really show you online, unfortunately. We do have some good videos on our Train Online. I think Amy already linked you to that earlier. But we have some good videos on how to capture a bee. I will say there's a couple different methods. You can swing. This is maybe like the obvious one, but you can swing basically through the flower and get the bee in your net that way. But I also like to teach people this tent method. You can see the photos on the right here where you just like set your net down on top of the bee and you hold the top up. And bees actually like to climb and fly up. So it's a really easy way to capture bees that way if you have like a ground flower. So I recommend checking out the videos and obviously practicing before you go out. Even if you don't see bumblebees, you can practice on, whatever insect you feel comfortable catching. Okay, it's important to track the host plant. So you'll want to make sure you label the vial with letters or numbers, and then take a photo of the vial and the flower to have for your information when you're going back through your photos later. Once the bees are captured and your host plant is recorded, the bees go in a cooler on ice. And this ice should be cubed ice like this. You don't want to use ice packs. And the reason for that is ice packs can be too cold and they're just not like consistently cold throughout the cooler. So you don't want to use cubed ice. Don't leave the bees on ice for longer than 90 minutes. And obviously keep those caps above the ice line because ice can melt really quickly in the summer in the south. So that's a safety for bees right there. So the bees are chilling. You want to make sure you fill out the end of survey information here. And then while they're chilling is a good time to do your habitat assessment. So this shouldn't take you more than 5 or 10 minutes. It's pretty straightforward. First, you're going to choose the habitat type that you're in. Here's your options on the left there. And then also a surrounding habitat type. And you should choose at least one surrounding habitat type, but you can also choose 2 or 3 depending on where you are. Just whatever is around the main habitat type. And then how much of your survey area has flowering resources available. This you're going to circle. And this is like how much of the area could you actively look for bees on flowers. You'll want to see if you saw any potential nesting habitat. Did you see bunch grasses or brush piles? Um, this is what bunch grasses look like, just in case you weren't totally aware. They can also look even more bunchy than that. And then some some notes on management. So, did you see signs of mowing? Did you see signs of fire? Did you see signs of agriculture? You might not know. This is really like make your best guess. Or do you suspect that it's there for some reason? These are important for us to find out what's happening at this site. And then also you want to list how many plant species were actually blooming when you were there, how many were in flower, and then list them. So you might be thinking, how am I supposed to know what all these plants are? I'm not a botanist. Some of you are thinking, I know every single plant I see. So I get that it's a range. Um, I would recommend Seek. Seek is a really good app for plant identification. It can at least get you to genus. iNaturalist is another one. And then also field guides, like books with, sections that are like, here's your red flowers, here's your yellow flowers. Those are really, really helpful as well. You can use common name if that's where you're at, but you can also use scientific name to make sure you have the right species. Also, please track your volunteer data. This helps us understand how much time and effort people are putting into this project, and we can share that information with our project partners and funders. Okay, final step is photographing. So, a really good thing about bumblebees is that they can be identified to species with good photos. And our protocol is to chill the bees so that we can get some of those really good quality photos of those key diagnostic characters that helps us to identify them. So these are all great photos. And here's a little brief bumblebee anatomy lesson so I can talk more about which photos are important. So we have the head of the bumblebee, and on the very top, the part that's black, we call that the face. And then almost like what looks like the neck is the vertex, and those hairs can be either black or yellow, and sometimes that can be a really important feature. The thorax is where the wings and the legs come out of. It's like often has some kind of like black dot or shape in the middle of yellow. And the hind leg, you can see that hind leg has that triangle that looks like it's almost like a bowl. That's the pollen basket. That's also a really key feature for us to tell male versus female. And then the abdomen has different segments called tergites, T1 through 6 for females and 1 through 7 for males. So some photos should include the head. The head's really important. We want to know what color is the face, what color is the top of the head, and then also the length of the cheek. Here's some different photos of the cheek. We have short cheek, we have a medium cheek, we have a long cheek. All of these bees, all of these cheek lengths are present in our region, and sometimes that's the only way you can tell species apart. Getting a good cheek photo is really important, and it also takes a lot of time to master getting the cheek in focus in the right angle. So I definitely recommend practicing that one and just taking quite a few pictures of that when you're in the field. Okay, the thorax. So you definitely want a picture of the top of the thorax to see is there a band? Is there a dot? Is it all yellow? And then the side of the thorax under the wing can be really important as well. And then the abdomen. So I want to show you these photos are the same and they work for both the thorax and the abdomen. So making sure to have a photo of the wings open of the abdomen so you can see is the tergite all yellow? Is there a crescent of a certain color in the middle, or is it all black? And then also side of the abdomen is also really helpful so we can make sure we see the color of all of the different tergites. And then the hind leg too. These are both photos that have a hind leg with pollen in them, which makes it easier to tell these are females. But sometimes it can be hard to tell a male from a female if there's no pollen. So getting a good hind leg image is also really important. Just a few more photos to look at that are great photos. Here we have a side profile where you can see under the wing on the thorax. You can see it's a decent photo of the abdomen. It's a great photo of the hind leg. The photo in the middle is a great photo of the abdomen and thorax with the wings open. And then the photo on the far right, we can definitely see the color of the hair on the back of the head as well as the face. It's an okay photo of the cheek. I think we could do better with the cheek. So some photo tips. You do want to make sure the bees are mobile when you're taking these photos, and that's because if they're not, it's just so hard to get the right angles. And if you notice you take your bee out, it's just not immobile, you can put it back on ice. As long as it hasn't been on ice for a really long time, you can put it back and make sure that it chills a little more. You do want to use a neutral background. That's really helpful so that we can make sure we see all the colors accurately. Check the photos while you're in the field. You might notice that what you thought was in focus really it wasn't in focus, and when you still have the bees in front of you, it's a lot easier to correct that. And then, yeah, blocking the wind is important too because an immobilized bee just has no chance against a wind that comes up. They blow away really really fast. So make sure your bee pictures are in focus. You can adjust the lighting. You can adjust the lighting, using your phone in the field, but you can also adjust your lighting when you get home and before you upload your photos. This can be really, really helpful for us. Um, Turning the bee on its back when it's chilled is a good way to get those face photos. Like that's a great cheek image there, and it's also a good image of the face and the vertex. Um, this is a good angle that I often use when the bee is chilled. Don't let your bees get wet. Usually this is like hazardous for the bee. Maybe it just rained and you have a wet bee, but often this happens if they came into contact with water in the cooler. It's not safe for the bees, and frankly, it's just really, really incredibly hard to identify a wet bee. And again, it's might feel weird at first, but you can gently open the wings using your fingers. Sometimes I use like the tip of a pencil or even a blade of grass to just gently open the wings. And if your finger's in the photo, that's okay because we really want to see the abdomen with the wings open, and it's kind of the only way to identify certain species. And when the bee wakes up, it's going to close its wings again and, fly off. It doesn't hurt them. So the little bee wakes up. It usually only takes a couple minutes. It's going to happen faster than you think, especially if it's a warm day. You want to place it in a safe area. You don't want to be more than 100 meters from where you captured it. Okay, and you photographed your bee. That's great. So some safety for bees. It's really important to sterilize your containers and nets between sites. So you want to use diluted bleach solution, an alcohol or hydrogen peroxide spray. You can also just use hot soapy water, but you want to make sure you rinse and then air dry afterwards so there's no chemicals getting on the bees. You want to limit the bees' temperature in the vials. You want to limit the bees' time in the vials and ambient temperature, meaning if you put the bee in a vial, don't like put the vial in your pocket and walk around. Just go put that bee in the cooler. Because if it's hot out, that can turn into like a greenhouse really quickly. And you just want to make sure the bee is cooled in the cooler. Limit the bee's time in the cooler, no more than 90 minutes. And then release the bees near their capture location. So you did it. You participated. Last step when you get home is to enter data. And I'm going to skip this and instead go to this because I think this might be more helpful. So this is an image of Bumblebee Watch. This is our data website, and you do need to have an account here to log on. So you're going to go to Add Bumblebee Sightings, and you'll see two options here. On the left, this is where you would submit your incidental observations, and on the right is where you submit your Bumblebee Atlas survey data. So you'll say submit sightings. You don't have to worry about this select from our regional projects down here. You just want to go to submit sightings. You will enter your survey location by, if you already went there, you can just choose from a location. But if it's a location you've already been. But if it's a new place, you want to type in the name. This is a name you chose that you can remember. And you can either type in your lat long if you took it in the field, or you can use a map to select it on the map. And you can either, search by certain landmarks, zoom in until you find the spot, or you can actually type in an address or the name of a natural area or a state park to pull up that location on the map. Okay, so you're going to go field by field and fill in your data sheet based on what you've already written down in the field. So all the information that's on Bumblebee Watch, you've already gathered in the field. And so you just go through and you're going to fill in start time, end time, survey length, etc. you'll see a question that says, "Did you detect any bees in your survey?" And this is, if you say no, I didn't, I went out there, I did my survey, I put in all the effort, I didn't see any bees in the survey. That's called a null survey, and that's really important for us. It shows us that for some reason there weren't bees there, but you did try and you did look. And so you'd click no. If you did detect bees in your survey, you say yes. And then you type your name that say yes, everything is accurate. And you're gonna then add a sighting for each individual bee that you encountered. So you can upload up to 5 photos. And we have the option to use Bee Machine, which is an AI identification tool. And the way this is being used now really is just as a tool for you to have instant gratification to know what you saw in the field. We actually still come in, absolutely, and identify the species using all of our tools that we always use. But the AI tools, it's more for you to just see if you're right or to learn more using that tool. But you can also use the manual field guide. And the field guide, when you click on it, you can say like it has a black face, it has a black dot on the thorax, and it'll take you through some different diagnostic characters to help you identify your bee. You can also just say bumblebee species, and that means I'm not sure what kind of species it is. That's totally fine. We're gonna come in and help you identify those. You want to add the sex of your bee and then also add the host plant. So you're going to do this for each of the bees that is associated with that survey. I want to just give you some quick tips for how I organize my data. So on the right, you can see this is like my data sheet, and I say, okay, my vial, I pull the first vial I have out of my pocket, I catch a bee in it, I see this is vial G, and I take a photo of vial G with next to the plant, which is Solidago curtisii, mountain goldenrod. And then I also write it down on the data sheet so I remember vial G goes with Solidago curtisii. And then the way I organize my photos is before I take photos of each bee, I take a photo of that vial so that when I'm looking through my photos in my phone, they're all separated by a vial. So vial G, and then I have my 3 bee photos. And then vial 8, that means I'm coming to a new bee. I have 4 bee photos of the same bee. That's just how I organize my data. And I think it might be helpful for you too. However you want to organize your data so you can keep track of it is great with us. Okay, you have uploaded your data. You've done great. I will say it's really helpful to upload your data as soon as you can after you do your survey so that if you forgot to write down anything, you still have the ability to recall what happened that day in the field. I want to share with you a couple more resources. So these are the resources that we use to identify bees. The Bumblebees of North America is it's the guide of all guides for identifying. This is a book you can purchase online, but we do have a free resource on our website, the Bumblebees of the Eastern United States. And this shows you all these different kinds of morphs, tips, ranges. This is just a really good free resource that I recommend looking at. You can print it out and bring it with you. Also, to learn more about bumblebee identification, you can join us in 2 weeks, and I'm going to talk a lot more about which species you can expect to find where, what traits you're looking for. We'll learn more about like photography tips, some lookalikes, some challenging species, etc. Yeah, I hope to see you there. But also, if not, I'm going to record it and put it on the website so you can watch it at your convenience. So that's the information I have. I do want to acknowledge our supporters. Again, the work we do, I believe it's so important, and the fact that you're here, I'm sure you also believe that it's really important. And we are so grateful to be supported by so many important people and organizations that believe in what we do. And thanks again to our partners that make it possible in the region. We definitely couldn't do it without them. So it looks like we have about 10 minutes left for questions. And yeah, I'm glad that I was able to share all of that with you, and I know it's a lot, and feel free to come back and watch any of this if you need to again. But let's go ahead and answer some last questions.
Yeah, there's 2 questions that popped up while you were talking, so we can go through those. And if anybody else has questions, feel free to enter them in the chat or the Q&A while Avery's answering these. So one is the cell adoption renewed each year? If I adopt a cell this year, am I automatically assigned that cell next year?
That's a good question. We recommend that you actually adopt um, a grid cell each year. So if you adopted it last year, you should go back in and re-adopt it this year. And that's just because we kind of start each year with a fresh slate and we share that information with our partners and we look at it to see like where should we be putting more of our effort to see if someone's already adopted it or not for this year. So yes, please adopt it each year that you plan to survey it.
Nice, thanks. The next question is, how far in advance would we need to let you know if we want to survey at a state park?
That's a great question. Um, I would say as soon as you can. This process can be kind of long, and as you imagine, state parks get a ton of different requests for research projects and research permits. So if you already know that you want to survey at a state park, you should go ahead and fill out that on the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas website, there's a big button that says, I want to survey at a state park, register here. And then it'll show me that you'd like to be added to that permit. If you can't find that for any reason, you can also just email me and I'll make sure to request that you're added to that permit. And sometimes it takes a while, so the sooner the better. And some states are faster than others too. It just depends what they have going on. Does anybody have anything else they would like to ask? Well, we're all here. Okay, well, I'm also going to ask, since we have a couple minutes, I would love to see where people are planning to survey this year. If you want to put in the chat any places you know have good habitat or that you're planning to survey, I would love to see it. Oh, my email address. That's a great question. Here, I'm going to type my answer here. So I'm going to type in um, we have two email addresses, one for like the regional project and then our personal one. So I'll type in both. Well, I also think maybe some of you still need some more time to think about where you're going to survey, and that's totally fine. I realize this is kind of early this year. I just want to give everyone a heads up as to what to be looking for, how to apply for permits. And I know some of you also might already be seeing bees where you live and are planning to at least, start submitting incidental observations, which would be great. Um, I really recommend going to the Southeast Bumble Bee Atlas website and looking through that map that I created. I put a lot of time into picking out some places that I think are going to be good habitat. And so I do recommend going and checking it out. And you can always reach out if you have any questions. All right, well, thanks so much for being here. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna cough.
Hey, Avery, before you go, there's another question that popped into the Q&A. Actually, a couple.
Okay, I am ready.
So this would be my first year surveying. Would it be too much to survey two of the priority sites near me, NC 122 and 136?
I think that's really up to you. If you feel like you have the time and you're willing to put in the effort, I definitely think people do survey multiple grid cells in 1 year. And if you need any help, you can always reach out. Um, yeah, I'm sorry, I have a cough. 1 second. Okay, that was a lot of talking. I think I'm back. But I will say, yeah, I think you could definitely survey two grid cells in 1 year, and we'd be really grateful.
Awesome. The last question that I see is there a Southeast Facebook site too?
Oh, yes, there definitely is. You can look on the Bumblebee Atlas. You can search Bumblebee Atlas and you'll see our group. We have a group within the Bumblebee Atlas. Maybe I can link it here. I'll do that. Hmm. Okay, for some reason I'm having a hard time pulling it up right now, but you should be able to search the Bumblebee Atlas Facebook page, and then we're a group within the Bumblebee Atlas. If you're having trouble finding it, you're welcome to email me. Oh, great. Somebody put it in there. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yay, thanks, Amy. I do make sure to post events in there and some updates. There's also like some great event photos that come up. So yeah, definitely check out the Facebook page. And then we also have a newsletter. I imagine many of you are already on it. That goes out a lot more frequently during the field season, and you'll get more information there if we post any new like maps of places to go, if we have information about permits, events, any of that. Um, you can find a way to sign up for our newsletter on our website too. Any last final questions? Cool. Well, thank you all so much for being here and listening to me talk for a whole hour and a half. I really appreciate it. I think we're gonna have a great field season. I hope you can remember all you learned until then, but feel free to rewatch any of this or reach out if you need anything at all. We're really here to make sure that you have a successful season, and I'm sure we will. There's a lot of bumblebees out there waiting to be photographed. So, thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your evening.